Hey everyone. Yay, we made it to the last presentation. This is our last Zoom together. Yay, the semester's over. Congratulations. So let's talk about this material for our last Zoom. We want to talk about the topic of atheism and ethics and ask the very important question, do you need religion to be moral? And a lot of the thinkers we're going to cover are going to say, absolutely, you do not. You can be an upstanding, moral, wonderful, compassionate character without any sense of religion in your life. So let's share the screen and investigate this school of thought, this thinking, and move over here. So first of all, we're going to look at four horsemen of atheism. The four horsemen of atheism are mentioned up here. It's Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. These are four modern day, contemporary, 21st century thinkers who are well-known atheists, and they're all going to argue you do not need religion to be moral. A lot of times you might think, well, that's where we get these concepts of the 10 Commandments, and that's where we get the concept of the Golden Rule, and that's where we get the concepts of this and that, and ahimsa from India and so forth. But as we learn about what they're going to argue, a lot of them are going to argue kind of comparable back to evolutionary ethics, that a lot of those ideas are ingrained within us if you take that bottom-up approach, that it's part of our genetic history, it's part of our evolutionary background to be concerned about the other and to take care of your tribe and maybe extend that out beyond your tribe, to care about your children and your offspring and your mate and then your society and so forth. So betterment for your individual self as a result of that. So religious morality versus secular morality. So we're going to be saying that these are two different approaches to understanding the moral morality. And the religious position has oftentimes been one supporting what's called the veneer theory. And the veneer theory is this idea that we're kind of these animalistic, amoral characters, and we're like a thin layer keeping us in line, and that's what religion does. And religion kind of whips us into place, that keeps that, thin cover and protects us from that more Hobbesian animalistic self. And that is going to be challenged by other philosophers in this next bullet here. The atheist challenge is, instead of taking that top-down sense of morality that morality comes from on top, and that these moral rules are set by God to kind of keep humanity in line because otherwise we're going to tear each other apart. It's taking it more from the bottom-up approach and understanding that you can explain it from more natural explanations, you can explain it from more evolutionary explanation, and you're concerned with the other in this life and for the betterment of humanity here and now, and not so much because of the concept of an afterlife. So Richard Dawkins is mentioned here, and Christopher Hitchens is mentioned here, and then those are the only two four horsemen we'll talk about, and then we'll bring back de Waal. De Waal was from our earlier lesson plan on evolutionary ethics, and we'll talk about him for a minute, a little bit on Friedrich Nietzsche, and then we are done. So here we go. So Richard Dawkins, there's a couple things to read about him, and he talks about that religion. Now, some of this is a little controversial because I understand religion is a sensitive subject, so I'm just giving a caveat. Like when I'm presenting this, there's definitely ani kantavada, multiple perspectives, and you may not agree with it. So that's totally fine. But if we use religion and its text as a moral compass, he doesn't find that to be a very good thing to do, because sometimes these religious texts, not all of them, but sometimes they're filled with kind of horrific, vengeful stories, and it should not necessarily be used as the epitome of morality. We have sometimes cases of capital punishment and stoning people, for acts that, in our day and age, we would think were no big deal, but back then it was a big deal and people would be stoned to death for it. So we have to be careful not necessarily to connect religion and religious texts as a moral compass. And that's what he's saying. Sometimes people will read the religious texts and cherry pick like the best stories in there that says, oh, this is the height of morality. But if they really read all the stories, they'd realize there were some very questionable accounts maybe mentioned there as well. And what does he say? Moral compass generally independent of religion. So he's basically saying that our moral compass can be independent of religion. And a lot of our our moral systems are not so much connected, to the religious text. It's connected to the period of the time we live in. So things that we think are okay now were not okay in the past. And it's not that the religious text changed, that our whole disposition has changed. And the Hegelian approach, as we move towards progress. So there's a philosopher named Hegel, and he had this understanding that societies were in a state of progress and to become kind of more and more enlightened. And if you look at how humans existence used to be to how it is today and how much enlightenment thinking has gone on, yes, we have horrific stuff going on in the world today. Yes, we have sexism and racism and tragedies right and left, but overall it's better than it used to be, and let us continue that progress and let us continue to grow and learn and become more enlightened human beings. And so using the moral compass of the past isn't necessarily a good one. Let's move with the understanding that we can learn and change and grow and not necessarily pull from the religious text is what he's arguing. Okay, then he has another section to talk about where he's arguing that we have, this is again repeating that evolutionary ethics lesson plan, that altruistic genes, that natural sense of compassion and empathy are ingrained within us. And what else do I want to say? A lot of people say, well, I get my inspiration from religion. And he would say, you know, you can get that inspiration also from philosophy and from science. I realize again, this one here is a little bit touchy and challenging, and I feel kind of uncomfortable bringing this line up. But he wrote a book called The God Delusion, and he has a whole chapter in it dedicated to the topic of how fair is it to raise a child with scary monster threats that if they do something wrong, that they're going to be taken off to hell and forever tortured for all eternity. So he kind of finds that to be offensive and challenges that as a bad example of morality. And again, you might think, well, I come from a religion and I think my religion teaches messages of compassion and love, and it does. I'm sure it does. Is he cherry picking himself then? Is he cherry picking the bad stories? Perhaps you can say that, but maybe his whole point is that we have to be careful when we just connect morality and religion, like blend it together, and just realize that it's a mixed bag, that religion's going to offer some beautiful accounts. Religion's also going to have some pretty scary stuff in there and doesn't serve necessarily as the model of our moral behavior, and it's going to be a mixed bag. Let's leave it at that. Okay, so moving here, we have Hitchens, and Christopher Hitchens passed away a few years ago from esophageal cancer, but he challenges it even a little deeper here, and he just really might make your hair stand up on your skin, or your hair, or whatever, how you say that. He says that religion can lead actually to immorality. And how could that be the case? Well, he says that because he's arguing that there's been a lot of things in the name of religion that have been horrific acts. And all one has to do is think of history and think of examples of that. And I can think of two examples that I just lectured on in my world religions class. One was the Crusades, and one was the Inquisition. And these are just two horrific things that happened in world history, all in the name of religion, all in the name of God. And in one case, millions of people were massacred. That is with the Crusades. And in the Inquisition, people were turning in their neighbors and turning in their family members to the inquisitors and having them arrested and tried and sometimes murdered. So here we have horrific things that have happened in the name of religion. So that's what Christopher Hitchens is pointing out. And that's what he says. There's, you know, examples throughout all different backgrounds that we can point to. And what else did I want to say? He raises a question, he poses a question. Can you think of an evil action performed because of religious faith? And I just gave you one. And then he says, but a more difficult one is this. Is there an ethical statement or action performed by a believer that a non-believer could not have done? And he said, that's a challenging one. Is there anything that only a believer can do ethically, but a non-believer cannot do? And he doesn't think so. Just I'll kind of answer it for you there. You can think about that though, and ask yourself, and if you can come up with something, maybe you can share that. So DeWall here comes along, and he's our famous, ethical evolutionarist thinker. And he agrees with the bottom-up sense of morality. He does agree that primates show that precursor to morality or compassion. It's like the building blocks of morality. He thinks that empathy has social origins. We already covered all of that, but he agrees with all of that stuff I just mentioned. But one thing he does challenge, and he kind of thinks that we have to be careful, the secular humanist atheist out there and how you're terming it. He says that religion is offering people like a great sense of inspiration and the naturalistic world, the scientific naturalistic world it's supposed to be more, the scientist is supposed to describe nature, not prescribe how to live. And the naturalist worldview may be devoid of that inspiration that religion gives us. He also points out that when we talk about secular humanism, we have what's called the Humanist Manifesto. And if you read its principles, it starts to itself sound like a religion. And that our Western society and human culture in general are steeped in religious morality, even though we say we're separate from it. And there's the seculars versus the religious. Even the seculars are steeped in that kind of mentality from the past. So there's some challenges that he presents to somebody like Dawkins. Now, this is a lesson plan, again, that may be a little challenging for some of you, and I apologize to end the whole semester off on such a challenging lesson plan. I just finished religion and ethics, and talked about the beauty within all the religions and all the different approaches that they have. But now I'm going to be presenting, a different perspective, a Nit Kantavada, and this is going to be Nietzsche's perspective. And Nietzsche has, he's a 19th century philosopher who died in 1900, and what we want to know about him is he is known as this classic atheist, and he is known to say a lot about morality. But he has a very positive view of Jesus, and that's something a lot of people aren't aware of. So let me walk you through his philosophy. How can I do an entire philosopher in 5 minutes? We've already been exposed to him. We already learned that he has that whole concept, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. A lot of people focused on that in, I think it was lesson plan 3 when we learned about his teachings. But he has a lot to say about morality and religion and atheism and so forth. So what do we want to talk about? Let's see. So he doesn't, let me skip some of these. I gave you some quotes of his, 10 quotes of his to read that kind of captures all of this. But his view is, he is an atheist. He doesn't ascribe to the concept of that theistic God. He thinks that he's got this passage called The Madman. It's a very famous passage of Nietzsche that humans are now in a stage in history in the 19th century, going to the 20th century, where we can explain things much more naturally. We can explain things through a scientific explanation. So all our old, sophomoric, archaic ideas are no longer tenable, and we are now more moving towards an enlightened position. And in that regard, he thinks that, religion's going to die out because we have more of a natural scientific explanation for things. He says that it's a really tough realization. It's really hard. It's like a birth pain. It's a horrible, painful thing to go through. But the paradigm shift will be resultant in such a magnificent new worldview. He talks about like this open sea awaits us. So he talks about it's both horror, painful, and exaltation, like this magnificent worldview. And he thinks that when we undo our old perspectives, and then we usher in a new way to see the world, our moral systems will also change. He thinks that the old moral systems need to be reevaluated. And an example, in the old moral systems, I'm covering so much, I don't know why I'm tackling this right now, but in the old moral systems, there's a couple things he challenged. He basically thought that sometimes the meek and the weak were admired, and instead he says we should place our admiration for the strong and the creative and the independent thinker. Those are values that we should hold dear to us. He also thought that religion in his day and age was anti-nature and anti-life by being anti-sex, and he himself thought we should rethink how we view sexuality. It should be something that's beautiful and natural and normal and wonderful and allows for our species to continue, as opposed to seeing it as this guilty act or, unacceptable act and the original sin of humanity. And so all of that thinking needs to be rethought. He also thinks that in terms of Christianity, he has great admiration for Jesus. He has this understanding of the height of humanity he calls the Übermensch, and all of us can aspire to become Übermensch, these enlightened, strong, creative individuals. And he thought of Jesus as one, and that's something most people aren't aware of. He thought of as a man of compassion, somebody who forgave those that were doing harm to him, and all that kind of mentality he had great admiration for. He was not happy with the message of Paul. Paul is recognized as the founder of Christianity because Paul taught this concept of heaven and hell and damnation and revenge and sin and all of that. He doesn't think that was in the message of Jesus. The message of Jesus is one of love and compassion and forgiveness. So that's something to discuss when you're looking at that whole topic of atheism and ethics, that he is an example of not a modern day thinker, but a 19th century thinker that really has a lot to say on this area. he is a very powerful philosopher. Some people say he does philosophy with a hammer, like he really bangs it on the table and really has a message to come across. But the Ubermensch is somebody, and I love how he defines it. It represents kind of the moral hero. I said creative, somebody who doesn't go with the herd, somebody who sees their enemies as their allies and as their teachers, somebody who recuperates from the blows of life and sees them as, in a weird way, blessings because you can learn from them, and is free of guilt and resentment, and embraces Earth as its home and conquers nihilism or a meaningless world and creates meaning through how they choose to live. Somebody who says yes to life, yes to Earth, and emerges out of it a transformed, mature thinker, etc. So that is kind of Friedrich Nietzsche in a nutshell. So I'm sure I did not do justice to him, but he has a lot to say in this area. So I have readings, films, and a post question. For your post, I give you an option to talk about Friedrich Nietzsche's thinking, or I give you an option to talk about this just in general. So you have to choose between those two, or you can do both if you have time to do so. Hopefully, hopefully, nobody's too offended. This is a challenging lesson plan. And again, I'm a world religion scholar. I love world religion, so I'm not anti-religion in any way. I just think in a philosophy class, we have to investigate all different perspectives. And I think that those that are going to argue that you can be moral without religion have something to be said, and we should hear that argument as well. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to thank everybody for being part of this class and watching these Zooms and hopefully learning from them. I've never done Zoom before, and I'm doing Zoom for the first time, and it's very good way for me to give my little mini lectures to you, and hopefully it's all under 30 minutes. Again, I forgot to clock myself. But namaste, last time. I wish everyone well. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful end of the term. Bye-bye.